How's it going, everyone? This is Connor from CE Rocketry, and today we're going to be starting on a new rocket build for me. This is the LOC Precision Iris, the Park Flyer model. This model can be launched on anywhere between D to H power engines, making it very versatile. You can launch it between a few hundred feet to upwards of 5,000 feet, depending on which motor you use. Now, this kit isn't much different than any of the other rockets in my ever-expanding collection. It's the same principles with motor mount, fin tabs, and the like, but that being said, there's always more to learn, always more to grow in rocketry. I should mention here that I am not a professional by any stretch of the imagination, so don't take anything I do here to be a tutorial. Otherwise, I am learning just as much as any beginner is, so yeah, whatever I do probably shouldn't be done. Always check for people who know what they're doing when you build these rockets. But nonetheless, let's go ahead and get started with the build. Alright, so the first thing that we're going to do here is work on the motor mount assembly. So this is about how it's going to turn out. Essentially, this is what's going to act as the mediator between the motor and the body tube itself. Now this cord right here leading into this longer cord, this is going to be epoxied onto the motor mount itself. Now these pencil marks here are for me to know where I shouldn't epoxy quite yet, so here and here I don't want to put epoxy because eventually we're going to be epoxying these fins on, and I don't want to have epoxy there inhibiting these tabs from mounting onto the motor. So yeah, we're going to go ahead and get started here. We're going to mix up some epoxy and see how this goes. Alright, it's the next day and the epoxy's all dry. It looks like it came out pretty well. I was a little worried about this whole shock cord and the way it's just kind of epoxied on the motor mount. The instructions say to epoxy 2 inches of the shock cord on. I wrapped it on both sides and did about 1.5 inches on both sides. So that should be enough to compensate. Should hold up. This bottom end is nice and flush. I think this turned out well. I was trying to think of a way to have a motor retention system in this rocket. I don't think that's going to happen just because of how thin this centering ring is. So we may just have to go with friction fit for the actual motor retainment, but that should be okay. Other than that, I was able to keep the epoxy out of the fin tab areas. There is a kind of a lack of epoxy on this bottom centering ring, mostly due to that I actually ran out of epoxy while I was making it. I have more, but just out of ready epoxy, which is the first for me. Usually I make way too much, so I guess that's okay. I'll probably make a little more later and go over this bottom centering ring. But other than that, I think the motor mount is done and we are about ready to install it into the body tube. Alright, so we are ready to move on to the next portion of our Iris build. This is going to be installing the motor mount into the body tube. Before I did that, I wanted to mention a few things that I actually did incorrectly on this motor mount. So this Kevlar cord right here, you're only supposed to have one side epoxied on. I think I mentioned this earlier. I did too, just because that's what I did on my certification rocket. So basically, I did epoxy on both sides because I figured it added some strength. However, there's a bit of a downside to that. So if you have a motor that extends past the motor mount, then if this Kevlar cord isn't long enough, the motor will actually reach the end of like this where the cord loops back around. So I mean, it's obviously not a big issue on this motor mount, but on my Cert 2 rocket, the Kevlar cord actually loops like right about here, and the motor is longer than that, and so I'm probably gonna have to cut something, but that's not what this video is about. This video is about the Iris. Now I thought about trying to quote fix this, but it is not much of a problem because any motor that we're going to be flying isn't going to be this long, and if it is, then we're probably going to lose the rocket, to be honest, so I'm not too worried about that. I am planning on just keeping this rocket as more of a park flyer because that's what it's built for, so not too terribly concerned. So another thing I should mention is I did the fin spacing incorrectly. So there is enough room for the fin tabs to fit right in. However, something I did not take into account was that the slots for the fins are a little bit raised above the bottom of the body tube. So essentially the problem that we're having now is that in order for these fin tabs to be slotted into both the body tube and into the motor mount is no longer able to be flush with the bottom of the body tube because then the fin spacing is wrong. So basically to fix this problem, all we're going to have to do is move the motor mount forward so that the fin tabs slot through both the body tube and into the motor mount. Basically, what I'm talking about here is the motor mount is now kind of retracted into the body tube, if that makes sense. As you can see here on some of my other rockets, the motor mount sometimes even extends past the body tube. That just allows for a little more spacing for the motor and any nozzle that might be on it. Now, I don't think this will be much of an issue on these low-powered rockets. I just plan on flying this with, F motors and that kind of stuff. If it is an issue, we can just trim the bottom of the body tube here. But I'm just going to move forward with gluing it into place like this, and we will see where it takes us. Alright guys, so that section of the assembly went pretty well. You'll notice that I ended up installing the fins on as well. I wasn't planning that at first, but I had extra epoxy. I figured might as well go ahead and install the fins on while I'm at it. The centering section came out pretty well. It's a nice, if I can get my camera to focus, nice little epoxy fillet on there. I'm going to have to clean a little bit of it up because it is kind of interfering with the motor mount, but nothing too major. I got a little bit of epoxy on the actual body tube and some the fins a little bit. Obviously I would prefer that wouldn't happen, but we're gonna prime this with filler primer and sand it down anyway, so it's not that big of a deal. So now basically all I have to do on this portion of the build is to put some epoxy fillets between the body tube and the fins just for added support. And after that, this portion will be done. And now next up is going to be the payload bay section. I do have plans to make my own electronics bay. I've never worked with a full-on dual deployment bay like some of the higher powered rockets used. However, it's something I'd like to do in the future, and so I figure that making my own for this rocket would be advantageous because I can start learning how they work and do some research into how to make one. We aren't going to be utilizing it for dual deployment on this rocket, however, it would be nice to have a place to put altimeters and that kind of stuff just for fun. So I think I'm going to go ahead and 3D model an electronics bay that fits inside this coupling here. It'll be very similar to the electronics bays that many people use for dual deployment. Just going to have to do some research to figure out what all I need. I'm going to have to buy some hardware for that. However, that is going to be for next episode. In the meantime, let me know what you thought of this video. It's a little bit different style than what we normally have here on the channel. However, it's something I'd like to continue in the future. This is my first video that I've produced on my own, and so any feedback and advice would be very welcome. I'm still learning how to do all this, and so you'll have to forgive some of my stumbling over words and poor video quality. However, it's something I am planning on improving in the future. But that's going to do it for me today, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will catch you in the next one. Peace out.